One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
So this is part 2 of our introduction to the little mini-series on the Inflammation Nation, where we get to talk about autoimmune thyroid hypothyroidism, or Hashimoto's disease, as it's commonly called. And as we ended the first part of the introduction, we talked about how with autoimmune diseases of any kind, it doesn't have to be the thyroid, but any autoimmunity is a developing process that starts at a low level and typically builds to the point where it starts to begin creating symptoms. But quite often people are symptomatic, but they haven't lost enough integrity in that system, like the thyroid, to actually change labs like TSH values. But eventually, because there's no concept that the immune system is actually the problem, nobody's doing anything to control the autoimmune mechanism, so you keep losing functionality to the point where eventually you cross a threshold and then your labs change. So your TSH goes up, you get medicated and put on synthetic meds, and quite often referred out to different specialists for any unresolved thyroid problems, which, from the conventional mindset, clearly can't be the thyroid because the thyroid is quote unquote normal. But eventually what ends up happening is that some people start to look for help outside of the conventional medical model. Now, they might go to see an integrative medical doctor or nurse practitioner or osteopath, but quite often they end up even going beyond that into, seeing acupuncturist or nutritionist, or someone like me, like a chiropractor, who is trained in some form of natural medicine. Of course, we call certain approaches in natural medicine functional medicine. The problem is that word means different things to different people. So just because someone says they do functional medicine doesn't necessarily mean that they actually do something that's similar to what I do or what I teach in the seminars as we go around the country. The problem with natural medicine, whereas the conventional system is stuck in a hormone replacement model strictly based on your TSH level, the natural medicine world, by and large, there are many exceptions, but by and large, they're stuck in a 1960s nutritional model where they use things like low axillary or armpit temperature, giving iodine, tyrosine, and sometimes thyroid glandular supplements. And there's problems with each of those things. First of all, is that a low axillary temperature is not specific to the thyroid. You can have any metabolic issue or an illness, and you can have a low core temperature. So just because your temperature is low and you have thyroid symptoms doesn't mean it is your thyroid. Quite often we'll see tyrosine and iodine being given, but I'll tell you this, that even though iodine is required for the manufacturing of thyroid hormones in the thyroid gland, there's not a single thyroid research article or chapter in a medical textbook about thyroid that doesn't begin with a couple of different statements. One is recognizing that the most common cause of hypothyroidism in developed countries is autoimmunity. It's Hashimoto's disease. But the next statement typically is that iodine is one of the most common and potent triggers of the autoimmune reaction. And so we kind of have this dichotomy, a double-edged sword, where on one hand we need iodine to make thyroid hormones, but if you take too much, which quite often we see very high milligram doses, when in fact your body only needs microgram doses on a daily basis. But nevertheless, higher intake of iodine, which we see just simply in the salt supply in countries where salt has been introduced to correct iodine deficiency, that is perhaps the most common trigger of Hashimoto's disease. It's simply the North American or standard American diet. Tyrosine is interesting because while it gives someone kind of like a thyroid boost or a thyroid-like boost in metabolism and energy and maybe brain function and focus, there's not a single study that I'm aware of that shows that taking tyrosine actually increases thyroid hormones. What it does do, it is a precursor to what are called catecholamines, things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, or basically adrenaline that mimic the same symptoms you get or the same function you get when you have adequate thyroid hormones. So it increases your energy production, your metabolism, sharpens your brain, and so on. And then finally, one of the common things is taking thyroid glandulars. And to be honest, that actually can have a place in somebody's protocol and somebody's personalized approach, but certainly not as a primary strategy. The old school idea is that if you have autoimmunity and your immune system is attacking your thyroid, there's this very incorrect thought that if you take a thyroid glandular supplement, somehow you're going to trick your immune system into leaving your own thyroid alone and just attacking the thyroid hormones that are in the supplement that you're taking. And there's just absolutely no evidence of that. And it's really just wishful thinking. But having said that, there are places where thyroid glandular supplements or things that are found in those can be beneficial, but as part of a larger strategy. One of the things that you'll see when you go into the natural medicine world, and I think you see it more so than in the conventional world because the conventional system is so standardized, is that when you walk into any given natural medicine practice run by a single doctor or a group of doctors, they basically have a shtick. Like everyone's doing their own thing. And they might be doing similar things in different ways, but oftentimes natural practitioners have one thing that they do, and they believe with every fiber of their being that that one thing is always the answer to something like autoimmunity. And so a lot of practitioners are stuck in that 1960s model, and they have a mindset that says, well, all autoimmunity is caused by mercury. And so all they do is focus on chelation and getting rid of mercury. Or they might look for some other kind of a universal trigger, like all thyroid issues, all autoimmunity is caused by parasites. And so you have to do a parasite cleanse. And each of those things, again, can have value at the right place at the right time. But what we can't do is have this mindset that there is a one size fits all. That's the medical approach, right? Well, you've got thyroid, everyone goes on synthetic T4, and there's really nothing else to be done. You don't want to fall into that in the world of natural medicine, whether they say they do functional medicine or not. There's no organization that owns that phrase. There's no governing body that says, well, if you use it, you better be doing these things these ways. It's kind of like the Wild West out there, but nevertheless, the phrase is out there and people use it kind of freely. So you have to exercise some judgment. A lot of times what ends up happening is that people start to discover new things, like the availability of natural approaches like functional medicine and some of the core principles of treating people as biochemically unique, not having one size fits all approaches, and then understanding that there are certain things that will benefit most people, but at some point you have to individualize or personalize your approaches. And so we might do heavy metals with somebody and not with others. We may focus on parasites with one person and others, or maybe those issues are not issues at all. And maybe it's some kind of an immunotype problem where the immune system is stuck in a pattern of dysregulation and imbalance for some reason. And we have to not only support the immune system, but also figure out what's driving that imbalance and perpetuating it. And so there's so many different things that can relate to each individual person. You just simply can't have that one size fits all mentality. You can't have a shtick unless your shtick is treating everybody as an individual and focusing on what they need. But a lot of times people go into the natural world and some nice things happen, even with general approaches. Some good things can happen because human function is the same from one person to the next. So we have this kind of broad base of systems that all work the same from person to person to person. But once we get beyond that layer, everything really needs to become individualized. So a lot of people have this initial enthusiasm, but that begins to fade at some point because these one-size-fits-all shtick type approaches begin to fail at the level because they lack individualization and specificity. And a lot of times alternative practitioners approach complex scenarios like an autoimmune thyroid with really no overall process and plan. They're like, okay, well, I always do this first, so let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll see what we have. Yeah, and so they kind of grope from visit to visit to visit without really getting to know you and your physiology, or without thinking perhaps 3 or 4 steps ahead. And I think that that's one of the things that really distinguishes a good clinician from an average clinician is not only do I know what I'm doing this week, next week, I'm pretty sure I know what I'm going to be doing in a month and 2 months down the road. Like having a plan, having a strategy, having a roadmap, if you will, is hugely advantageous. It doesn't mean that you have to stick to that 100%, but I teach this concept to doctors that what you need to have is a strategic plan that is firm enough that it gives you structure and predictable steps, but it's flexible enough that you can change that anytime there's a compelling reason to do that. And I think that that's a hallmark of good clinical strategies. A lot of docs have this thyroid protocol. Like if someone says to you, like, I've got a thyroid protocol, run screaming, because there's no such thing, to be honest. Again, if you understand biochemical uniqueness and how some things relate to everyone, but at some point you have to personalize your approach, you'll realize that all one-size-fits-all strategies will fail. You can literally waste months, perhaps even years, looking for the right approach. And I would say that the average client who comes to see me with thyroid issues and Hashimoto's has seen on average 5 to 7 other practitioners of different types by the time they find me, and we start to really dig in deep to their history, their mechanisms, and then fabricate an approach and a program that's right for them as an individual. The problem with all of this is that whether it's in the world of conventional endocrinology or if it's in the endocrinology side of natural or functional medicine, is that very few people are addressing the immune system, and that's the core problem. Let me say it this way. If you have Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, your problem is not your thyroid, your problem is your immune system. The thyroid is really the innocent bystander. And yes, we probably need to look at hormone replacement to replace what you cannot make on your own because you've destroyed part of the system that makes your hormones. But if you don't focus on the root cause or the overarching concept of immune dysregulation, inflammation, and autoimmunity, then you're not going to get the progress that you're looking for. So just to reiterate before I close on this introduction, there are a handful of strategies that tend to be helpful for most people with Hashimoto's. Those are kind of the low-hanging fruit things. And a lot of docs, that's all they do and they don't do anything else. Some people can make a few changes, a few basic changes, and actually do very well. If that happens, it implies that they had relatively stable immune function, relatively lower amounts of inflammation or triggers that drive inflammation. So they have fewer things to do and less work to accomplish. But your best strategy is to have a personalized program that's designed just for you. Either someone designs it for you or you learn enough about how all this stuff works that you can kind of do it yourself. But if you decide to work with someone, whoever you work with needs to have a very solid grasp of the neuroendocrine immune super system. And if you missed, the introduction, the first 2 or 3 episodes of the entire Inflammation Nation podcast, you might want to go back because I spent some time talking about the neuroendocrine immune super system. And the core concept is this, is that your brain, your hormones, and your immune system are all different parts of the same thing. They're not separate things. And in reality, you can't have a sensible conversation about an autoimmunity, which is an immune dysfunction, without talking about how the autoimmunity in your thyroid impacts and is impacted by your brain and your hormones, and how your brain and hormones talk to each other to set you up to have good immunological control and balance. So it's all part of the same ball of wax, if you will. One of the main things that needs to be figured out for anybody who has an inflammatory autoimmune reaction to thyroid or any other tissue is to look at diet changes and nutritional supplements. And ideally, what you want to do is base your supplementation protocols, particularly your supplementation protocols, on testing and not guessing. And that's a mantra that a lot of us use. I test, I don't guess. There are some things that are relatively predictable based on symptoms, but I've learned the hard way over the years that I don't know until I look. So, for example, when we're dealing with autoimmunity, leaky gut comes up quite often as a clinical problem. And I honestly don't know if someone has a leaky gut, even if I have profound symptoms that might be screaming, oh, this person probably has a leaky gut. I don't know if they do or not until I run a test to figure that out. So testing and not guessing and using the diagnostic strategy and the results of that to piece together the story of your physiology and where your problems actually are allows us to take a very complex picture and cone it down to a handful of things that are more manageable, that if we can shift that picture, we see a change in the entire picture. And that's really, again, another hallmark of a good clinician. So I'm going to leave it there in terms of introductions. Perhaps what I'll do in the next discussion is start to, I'll field some questions that are very common that we've, either had clients ask us directly, working like one-on-one clients, or maybe in forums or social media. People throw us questions all the time. And so maybe we'll deal with some of those main questions, and then we'll put together kind of a common sense approach. And really, it's a body of knowledge that you can access and then you can harness to educate and learn yourself. And at some point you get to choose, do I know enough to make some decisions on my own, or maybe I need some guidance? And at that point you can reach out, and we'd be happy to have a chat to see if we can help. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.